Lucia stepped into the grand hall of the funeral, her black dress flowing like a shadow behind her, the weight of grief pressing down on her chest. Her father's coffin rested at the center, surrounded by mourners whose somber faces mirrored the sadness she felt deep inside. But amidst the sorrow, her eyes immediately caught the sight of Matteo, her husband, leaning casually against the wall, laughing quietly with his family. His attention was not on her or the man they had come to honor, but on Valeria, the young mistress he had brought with him. The contrast struck Lucia like a physical blow. The woman who should have been beside her, mourning, was instead fawning over Valeria, offering her whispered compliments, while Matteo's family hovered nearby, nodding and laughing at every word. Lucia's lips pressed into a thin line, and her mind struggling to stay calm. The whispers that had begun to stir around the room felt like knives in her chest. Guests murmured about the audacity of Matteo and the shamelessness of Valeria, but nobody dared confront them directly. She felt isolated, humiliated, and enraged, yet she maintained her composure. Every step she took toward the front, where her father lay, was measured, her posture flawless, as if her dignity alone could shield her from the sting of betrayal. Her fingers tightened around the edges of her purse, knuckles white, and she forced herself to breathe evenly, unwilling to allow tears to cloud her vision just yet. Matteo's laughter grew louder as Valeria leaned closer, her perfumed hair brushing against his arm. "You have such exquisite taste, Matteo," she cooed, her voice carrying just enough for Lucia to hear. Matteo chuckled, running a hand over her back, proud of the attention she lavished upon him. His family, too, had joined the display, offering approving nods and discreet glances of admiration. Lucia's heart sank with every passing second. The people who should have been her allies, her confidants, were instead witnesses to her public humiliation. She felt invisible in her own life, a shadow eclipsed by a mistress and a husband who had forgotten every promise he had once made. Yet beneath the searing pain, a quiet resolve began to form. Lucia had grown up in the shadow of her father's influence and wealth, learning lessons of patience, strategy, and strength. She was not powerless, not truly. Her father had left instructions, trusts, and allies that remained unknown to Matteo. She knew that beneath the veneer of grief and humiliation, she held the cards of influence and power. Every insult thrown her way, every smirk, every whisper of judgment would become fuel for a reckoning that Matteo could not even begin to imagine. Her composure was not weakness. It was the calm before the storm. The service proceeded, a blur of prayers, music, and mournful speeches. Lucia's eyes rarely left her father's coffin, though she remained acutely aware of the scene unfolding beside her. Matteo's hand brushed Valeria's in what seemed a casual gesture, though to anyone paying attention, it radiated triumph and arrogance. The mourners around them seemed unsure where to focus their attention, torn between the grief of the occasion and the audacity of the display. Each glance they stole toward Lucia was loaded with speculation and judgment, and she felt the weight of it all. Yet she walked with her head held high, projecting an image of strength even as her heart burned. As the priest spoke of her father's virtues, Matteo and Valeria whispered among themselves, sharing inside jokes and quiet laughter. The hypocrisy and insensitivity of their behavior struck Lucia with every word, yet she refused to show anger openly. She had learned that visibility was a trap in moments like these. Patience and subtlety were far more powerful than open confrontation. She scanned the room carefully, noting who was paying attention to her, who was distracted, and who could potentially be swayed. Every person in the hall was a player in a larger game, and she intended to position herself strategically despite the public humiliation. Then, the first hint of intervention arrived, subtle yet undeniable. A tall man in a tailored suit, his presence commanding yet discreet, entered the hall and paused at the back. His gaze swept over the mourners, landing on Lucia with recognition and respect. She felt a small, almost imperceptible surge of relief. This was the godfather, a man her father had trusted implicitly, wealthy, powerful, and loyal. His quiet acknowledgement of her presence sent a ripple of reassurance through her, a silent reminder that the battle was not hers alone. Matteo and Valeria were still blinded by arrogance. They did not notice the shift, the invisible weight that had entered the room. Lucia's thoughts began to sharpen with purpose. This was not simply a day of mourning. It was a battlefield, and she would navigate it carefully. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered word would be measured and recorded. It used to turn the tide in her favor. She allowed herself a small, controlled exhale, the first release of tension since the service began. Her father's legacy, her hidden inheritance, and the unseen support of the godfather were instruments of power that Matteo had dismissed entirely. The humiliation he intended to impose upon her would not be permanent. It would be temporary, fleeting, and ultimately self-destructive. As the ceremony drew to a close, Lucia moved forward, a silent strength radiating from her every step. She acknowledged condolences with grace, accepted whispers of sympathy with calm dignity, and navigated the hall with precision. Matteo's pride remained unshaken, Valeria's confidence unshattered, yet beneath their composure cracks had begun to form. Every small gesture of superiority, every assumption of control, was being catalogued in Lucia's mind for the day when the roles would reverse. By the time the mourners began to depart, she had already begun to see the outlines of her strategy, the invisible threads that would allow her to reclaim power, dignity, and respect. The service ended, and mourners began to leave in clusters, offering quiet goodbyes and sympathetic smiles. Matteo lingered, attempting to project authority and control, whispering promises of attention and comfort to Valeria. His family remained close, reinforcing his apparent dominance. Lucia paused, taking a final deliberate glance at her father's coffin. She felt the weight of loss, yes, but also the stirrings of resolve, the certainty that she would rise from this day of humiliation stronger, wiser, and unstoppable. Matteo believed he had triumphed, and Valeria believed she had won, but neither of them understood the quiet storm brewing beneath Lucia's composed exterior. By the end of this day, she would no longer be a victim of their arrogance, she would be its reckoning. After the mourners had left and the hall emptied of soft whispers and condolences, Lucia remained behind for a moment, tracing her fingers along the polished oak of her father's coffin. The silence was heavy, yet it offered her clarity. Matteo and Valeria had left, their laughter and smug whispers fading into the hallways, leaving a void where humiliation and betrayal had dominated just moments before. Yet in that quiet, Lucia felt the pulse of possibility. Her father's legacy was not limited to memory. It was tangible, powerful, and hers. She could feel the weight of what had been entrusted to her, and the first spark of strategy began to flicker in her mind. Lucia stepped outside into the crisp air, the scent of lilies and rain mixing in the cemetery garden. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and allowed herself a moment of human grief. But even in mourning, her mind was already working. Matteo had underestimated her entirely. He had assumed that public humiliation would break her, that isolation would render her powerless. He had no idea of the quiet strength she carried, or the network of allies her father had prepared. Every whispered insult, every pointed glance, every smirk of triumph would be repaid in full, but strategically, publicly, and definitively. Her phone buzzed quietly in her purse. She answered it, hearing the familiar voice of her godfather, Don Alejandro. "Lucia," he said, and his tone both gentle and commanding, I saw what happened. You handled yourself with grace, as always, but now we must prepare for what comes next." She smiled faintly, relief and determination mingling in her chest. "I know," she replied. "They think they've won, but they have no idea what they've triggered." Don Alejandro chuckled softly. "Good. That is the spirit. Patience and precision will serve you better than anger. We will move carefully, but decisively." She nodded, though he could not see her, and tucked the phone away. The walk back to her family home felt surreal. Streets were quiet, the city carrying on its usual rhythm, indifferent to the upheaval that had occurred in the hall of mourning. Matteo and Valeria were elsewhere, plotting their next display of social dominance, and unaware that every misstep they had made would soon be turned against them. Lucia's thoughts were methodical. She reviewed the events of the funeral in her mind, cataloguing every glance, every whispered comment, and every gesture of arrogance. Each detail would become a piece of the puzzle, building toward a public reckoning that would leave them exposed and humiliated. At home, Lucia moved with calm precision, arranging documents, reviewing letters, and consulting the files her father had left for her. She was not simply grieving, she was preparing. Every property, every trust, and every connection was accounted for. Matteo had assumed she was powerless, but he could not have been more wrong. While he flaunted Valeria and assumed victory, she had quietly begun to assert control over assets he didn't even know existed. Every move he thought would secure dominance only widened the gap between his perception and reality. That evening, as twilight softened the city skyline, Lucia sat in the study, reviewing legal documents and financial statements with meticulous attention. Don Alejandro had arranged for discreet confirmations from lawyers, accountants, and trusted advisors. Each page revealed the magnitude of what Matteo had overlooked. Her father's fortune was vast, diversified, and strategically protected. Lucia's inheritance was not simply money, it was influence, authority, and leverage, all of which she could wield when the time was right. The realization filled her with calm determination. Matteo had displayed arrogance and ignorance. Now, patience and subtlety would serve as her weapons. A knock at the door startled her briefly. It was Rosa, her longtime friend and confidant, who had come to offer support. "Lucia," Rosa said softly, her eyes reflecting concern and empathy. "You're incredible. I can't believe how composed you were today." Lucia smiled faintly. "Thank you, Rosa. It was difficult, yes, but composure is necessary. Matteo thinks he can humiliate me into submission, but he has no idea how underestimated I am." Rosa nodded, her expression firm. "We will help. Whatever you need, we're ready." The reassurance strengthened Lucia's resolve. She was not alone. Allies existed, even if they had remained invisible during the funeral. As night deepened, Lucia began to outline the next phase of her plan. She would not confront Matteo and Valeria directly. Not yet. Their arrogance and carelessness made them easy targets, and patience would allow their own actions to reveal their flaws. She intended to use social settings, legal maneuvers, and subtle psychological tactics to expose their hypocrisy, all while maintaining her dignity and composure. Every action would be precise, every conversation calculated. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on her would be reversed, public and undeniable. Throughout the night, she reviewed the guest lists of social circles, the patterns of behavior among Matteo's family, and the connections of Valeria's acquaintances. Each piece of information was a thread to be woven into her strategy. Matteo's overconfidence, Valeria's naivety, and the family's desire to maintain appearances made them predictable. Their public arrogance would be their undoing, provided she acted with timing and subtlety. The thought of the future, then carefully constructed and inevitable, gave her a quiet satisfaction that grief alone could not provide. By the early hours of the morning, Lucia felt a sense of clarity. The day of humiliation had passed, but it had ignited a fire within her. Matteo and Valeria believed they had conquered her, but they were blind to the resources, intelligence, and patience she possessed. She would reclaim her dignity, restore her family's honor, and expose their arrogance to the world. The funeral had been a stage, but the real performance was yet to begin. Every step she took from this point would be deliberate, measured, and precise. The storm that had been quietly building would soon make itself known, and when it did, there would be no escaping its force. Lucia finally allowed herself to rest, leaning back in her chair, the weight of grief still present, but tempered by the resolve of action. The next day would be the first step in turning humiliation into triumph. Matteo had underestimated her completely. Valeria had misjudged her, and the family that had turned against her believed they had won. But as Lucia closed her eyes, she felt a quiet smile forming. They had no idea what they had triggered. The widow at her father's funeral was no longer powerless. She was patient, strategic, and quietly unstoppable. The following days passed in a blur of calculated observation and subtle maneuvering. Lucia moved through her daily life with an almost imperceptible grace, her face calm, her eyes sharp, cataloguing every interaction, every slip, every word that might reveal Matteo's overconfidence or Valeria's ignorance. Social gatherings, family visits, and casual encounters became her study, each person a puzzle piece to be fitted into a plan that would ultimately turn humiliation into undeniable power. Matteo and Valeria, still intoxicated by their perceived triumph, continued to flaunt their supposed dominance, unaware that every careless gesture, every arrogant remark was being meticulously recorded in Lucia's mind. She attended one gathering, a small but influential dinner hosted by a family friend, where Matteo expected to parade his mistress and demonstrate social superiority. As soon as they arrived, Matteo and Valeria moved through the room like royalty, exchanging smiles, laughter, and forced handshakes with the prominent guests. Lucia, in contrast, appeared quietly elegant, her dress understated but impeccable, her posture radiating controlled confidence. Yet she did not immediately confront them. Instead, she observed. Every smirk, every glance, every whispered comment that Matteo and Valeria exchanged was a testament to their arrogance. To anyone else, they appeared untouchable, but Lucia's mind was already weaving a web that would entangle them completely. During the dinner, conversations flowed with a mixture of polite civility and subtle gossip. Guests commented on Lucia's poise, her composure, and the undeniable aura of authority she carried. Matteo's overconfidence faltered slightly under the quiet, admiring glances cast toward his wife. Valeria, oblivious to the subtle shift, continued her attempts to impress, her voice carrying just enough for everyone to notice. She laughed at jokes Matteo had told, tilted her head in ways designed to draw attention, and adorned herself with gestures that screamed ambition rather than humility. But all of it, ironically, played into Lucia's hands. Their arrogance and naivety were visible to the right audience, and she was quietly ensuring that those who mattered most were noticing. After the dinner, as the gathering broke into small groups for conversation, Lucia moved to the side, where Don Alejandro waited. His presence was steady, a silent reassurance that her strategy had a foundation of power and influence. "They are careless," he said quietly, as they watched Matteo boast about a recent acquisition he had claimed as his own. "Every gesture they make is a step closer to revealing themselves. You must remain patient." Lucia nodded, her expression calm, though inside her pulse quickened with anticipation. "I see it now. Every word. Every look. They are handing me the advantage without realizing it." Don Alejandro smiled faintly. "Good. That is exactly what I want you to see. Control is not always in confrontation. It is in observation, in precision, and in timing." Lucia's thoughts returned to the funeral, to the humiliation she had endured, and to the quiet anger that had simmered beneath her composed exterior. Matteo had believed that public display and mockery could break her, but it had done the opposite. Each act of arrogance had provided her with insight, a way to exploit their overconfidence. Valeria, who had thought herself secure in her triumph, was a liability. Her naivety and lack of awareness made her easy to manipulate. Lucia's strategy required patience, but it also demanded psychological precision and a careful balance of subtlety and calculated revelation. The following day, she visited her father's estate to review documents, correspondences, and property records with her legal team. Every piece of information confirmed the magnitude of what she controlled. Matteo's assumptions, his arrogance, and his ignorance became even more apparent. He had never taken the time to investigate her father's holdings or understand the network of influence surrounding her. Every property, every trust, every ally had been meticulously arranged to empower Lucia, and she was ready to deploy them at the right moment. The power that had been invisible to Matteo and Valeria would soon be undeniable. Lucia also began coordinating discreetly with allies in social and business circles. Invitations to gatherings, subtle mentions of her influence, and carefully placed hints about her inheritance were designed to unsettle Matteo without revealing her full hand. Every guest she encountered became a messenger, every interaction a tool for exposing arrogance and fostering anticipation. Matteo's social dominance, once assumed to be unchallenged, began to show cracks. He continued to boast, unaware that the seeds of his downfall were being planted with careful precision, nurtured by patience, observation, and insight. As the week progressed, tensions mounted. Matteo's family remained blind to the danger, still celebrating his supposed triumph, while Valeria continued to flaunt her confidence. Yet Lucia noticed subtle shifts in their behavior. Guests began exchanging curious glances, whispered comments became more frequent, and an undercurrent of uncertainty rippled through social interactions. Her presence, calm and authoritative, highlighted the arrogance of those around her. She did not raise her voice, did not make accusations, but the contrast between her dignity and their carelessness was impossible to ignore. Then came the first opportunity for public exposure. Matteo and Valeria attended a high-profile charity event, intending to assert their dominance and showcase their influence. Lucia arrived discreetly, her elegance understated but impossible to overlook. She moved through the crowd, greeting influential figures with casual familiarity, noting every expression, every reaction. Matteo approached her with forced politeness, attempting to assert authority, but the room's attention had begun to shift. Whispers of her accomplishments, hints of her inheritance, and subtle acknowledgments of her father's legacy began to circulate. Matteo faltered, his confidence weakening, and Valeria's composure showed cracks. Lucia did not confront them directly. She allowed their arrogance and ignorance to work against them. Every misstep they made, every boast they offered, became part of a growing pattern, visible to those who mattered most. The contrast between humility, intelligence, and composed authority on her side, and arrogance, naivety, and careless pride on theirs was undeniable. She felt the satisfaction of strategy taking shape, of power poised to shift. The humiliation she had endured at the funeral was no longer a weakness. It was a prelude to a reversal that would be both inevitable and public. By the end of the evening, Matteo and Valeria's overconfidence had begun to unravel. Lucia's subtle maneuvers, her strategic interactions, and the quiet influence of her allies had begun to tip the balance. Whispers of her inheritance, hints of her influence, and subtle acknowledgement of her social power made themselves felt. Matteo sensed it, though he could not yet articulate the source of his unease. Valeria too was unsettled, realizing that the woman she had underestimated was far more formidable than appearances suggested. Lucia, calm, composed, and strategically empowered, left the event knowing that the stage for the final confrontation had been set. The storm was ready to break, and when it did, the consequences would be undeniable. The morning of the gala arrived with a crisp brightness that belied the tension simmering beneath the city's polished veneer. While the venue, a sprawling estate of glass and marble, gleamed under the sun, prepared for an evening of influence, power, and social performance. Guests arrived in clusters, dressed in impeccable attire, their conversations a mix of casual sophistication and strategic networking. Matteo and Valeria entered with a calculated air of triumph, confident that the world would once again witness their dominance. They moved through the crowd with practiced ease, offering smiles, handshakes, and carefully measured compliments. They were unaware that the stage they believed they controlled was about to shift irrevocably. Lucia arrived quietly, her presence understated yet impossible to ignore. Her gown, a deep emerald that caught the light with subtle brilliance, framed her with elegance and authority. She did not flaunt her arrival, or she did not seek attention. Instead, she moved with precision, observing the room, noting every expression, and identifying the key figures whose attention and influence mattered most. Matteo spotted her across the room, a flash of irritation crossing his face before he forced a casual smile. Valeria, sensing a challenge but unable to gauge its depth, attempted a confident wave. Neither understood the quiet power Lucia carried, the weight of inheritance, the loyalty of her allies, and the inevitability of justice. The evening began with a series of formal speeches, each delivered with meticulous care, designed to impress and inspire. Matteo leaned toward Valeria, whispering about the influence they were exerting, oblivious to the subtle shifts taking place around them. Meanwhile, Lucia approached a small group of influential guests, engaging them in conversation that was light, intelligent, and laced with understated charm. Her words carried weight without arrogance, and her presence commanded attention without demanding it. Observers began to notice, their whispers carrying through the hall, creating ripples of curiosity and admiration that could not be ignored. As the night progressed, the first signs of disruption appeared. Guests who had once deferred to Matteo's assumed authority began to linger near Lucia, drawn to her calm confidence and thoughtful insights. Subtle nods of recognition, quiet compliments, and discreet acknowledgments of her family legacy began to circulate. Matteo's overconfidence faltered as he noticed the shift. Valeria's composure wavered slightly, her eyes darting toward the growing clusters of attention surrounding Lucia. The mistress had assumed power through proximity, charm, and manipulation, but she had underestimated the force she now faced. Every glance, every murmur was a reminder that control was slipping from her grasp. Then, at precisely the moment when Matteo attempted to draw attention to a recent social accomplishment, the godfather, Don Alejandro, entered the hall. His presence was commanding, yet composed, and the room subtly shifted. Conversations halted, and heads turned. Lucia felt a surge of confidence as he approached, his gaze acknowledging her with pride and silent assurance. Matteo's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, and Valeria's bright smile became rigid. Don Alejandro's reputation preceded him, his wealth and influence known to all, and his recognition of Lucia as the true heir of her father's legacy was a quiet but undeniable statement. Don Alejandro moved toward the center of the hall, a subtle signal that the attention of all present should shift. He gestured briefly toward Lucia, his voice carrying authority and respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is an honor to acknowledge a remarkable woman, one whose legacy and influence are unmatched." Every word was deliberate, every syllable weighted with significance. The room fell silent, eyes turning toward Lucia, who remained composed, her expression serene. Matteo's arrogance wavered, replaced by a flicker of fear, while Valeria's carefully maintained confidence began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. As the godfather continued, he outlined the extent of Lucia's inheritance and her father's careful planning and the loyalty and trust she had earned over the years. The audience listened, captivated, realizing for the first time the magnitude of what had been invisible to them. Matteo shifted uncomfortably, his attempts at composure failing in the presence of undeniable authority. Valeria's attempts to whisper reassurances went unheard, her eyes wide with panic. Every gesture of superiority they had displayed over the past weeks and months now became a testament to their arrogance, magnified in the glow of Lucia's revealed power. Lucia stepped forward, her voice calm yet resonant, projecting confidence without aggression. She acknowledged the godfather's introduction with grace, her words measured, her tone steady. "I am honored by the recognition and humbled by the responsibility entrusted to me," she said, and allowing the weight of her presence and inheritance to resonate through the hall. Every guest felt the shift. Matteo and Valeria, who had assumed dominance, were suddenly exposed as overconfident, naive, and unprepared. The mistress, who had relied on charm and proximity, realized too late that she had been playing a game she did not understand. The revelation was complete when documents were presented, discreetly circulated among key attendees, confirming Lucia's ownership of significant assets, investments, and properties that Matteo had assumed were beyond her knowledge. Every whisper of disbelief, every murmur of astonishment amplified the humiliation of those who had underestimated her. Matteo's attempts to intervene, to reclaim authority, were futile. Valeria clung to his arm, desperate yet powerless. The audience, now fully aware of the reversal of power, looked on with a mixture of admiration, surprise, and quiet satisfaction at the exposure of arrogance and folly. By the end of the evening, the social and emotional reversal was undeniable. Matteo, once confident and proud, stood diminished, his public image fractured by his ignorance and arrogance. Valeria, whose confidence had relied entirely on proximity and influence, was exposed as naive and overreaching. Lucia, calm, composed, and radiant in her authority, had transformed humiliation into triumph, grief into strategic victory. The audience witnessed the culmination of patience, intelligence, and subtle power, and the consequences for Matteo and Valeria were evident. Lucia left the gala with her dignity intact, her influence established, and her father's legacy honored. Matteo and Valeria were forced to retreat into the shadows, their arrogance shattered, their social dominance undone. The humiliation she had endured at the funeral had been temporary, a prelude to a reckoning that was both public and definitive. As she stepped into the night, flanked by allies and guided by the quiet pride of achievement, she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The storm she had prepared for months had arrived, and justice, patience, and intelligence had ensured her ultimate victory.